I just want to say hi and welcome our panelists. First of all, Tatiana, thank you for presenting your book to us. So I'm Uli Bear, I'm a university professor at NYU. I also direct the Center for the Humanities, which is a place where we really try to be a resource for faculty from across the university in the humanities. We do a series of events. We host a fellowship program for humanities professors and doctoral students who convene on a weekly basis and talk about their projects. It was really nice to see Tatiana, who was part of that group last year. So she was part of a cohort of about 18 people who met on a regular basis to discuss their work. So some of her colleagues from across NYU in very different disciplines have heard her work, and we were just really fascinated and taken with the project that you're engaged in. Also, if I can say this, as an NYU faculty member, kind of your intellectual trajectory from Moscow to Tokyo to Cal Berkeley to NYU is really kind of something we try to be very open to keep on rethinking of what and who participates in our academic discourse. So I'm really pleased. So thank you for Seiji Shirane and Louise Young today to participate in this panel. I'm going to step out. And I just want to remind everybody who's in the webinar right now, thank you for tuning in. We will record this and make this available afterwards. Our hope and intention is also that it's useful for some of you in teaching. So you may be able to use parts of the video later on in the class where the topics that Tatiana is interested in and Seiji and Louise can be addressed in this format. And we have a lot of other events, so please look on our website and sign up for the email list so you can participate in other ones. And I'm just going to go right to it. So Seiji Shirane, thank you very much. Professor Shirane, you're going to take us into the meeting, and I'm going to just step out. I'll be here and be listening and watching. And it's really great to see you all.
So I'm Seiji Shirane. I'm assistant professor of Japanese history at the City College of New York. I received my PhD at Princeton, and Louise Young was generous enough to be my external reader of my dissertation back in 2014, and my book will be forthcoming also with Cornell University Press in late 2021, titled Gateway Imperialism, Colonial Taiwan and Japanese Expansion in South China and Southeast Asia, 1895 to 1945. Today's speaker, Tatiana Linkova, we're really excited about her book, which just came out with Cornell University Press. She's obviously assistant professor of Japanese history at NYU. As Ulrich mentioned, she received her BA from Moscow State University, MA from University of Tokyo, PhD from UC Berkeley. So really bringing her cosmopolitan background and experience to not only this project, but she's currently working on a second project, a comparative study of Japanese and Soviet empires and their colonial policies in the Mongolian lands. So we look very much forward to that second project as well. For our discussion today, we have Louise Young, for Scholars of Japan who needs no introduction, professor of Japanese history at University of Wisconsin-Madison, received her PhD at Columbia University. Her classic Japan's Total Empire, Manchuria and the Culture of Wartime Imperialism, was published in 1998, and her second book, Beyond the Metropolis, Second Cities and Modern Life in Interwar Japan, published in 2013. She's currently working on two book projects, tentatively titled The Idea of Class in Modern Japan, and also Rethinking Japanese Imperialism. The recipient of numerous awards, she was recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which we should celebrate as well. Without further ado, please welcome Tatiana.
Thank you so much. So thank you all for your interest in my book and for taking the time to join the event. I want to thank Louise Young for her comments and Seiji Shirane for his support too. So I began this project as a study of the Japanese left because it seemed to me that we know already a lot about liberal democratic and right-wing nationalist movements in Imperial Japan. In comparison, Japanese leftist thought and movement have not been studied in such depths, and generally there is a still perception that the leftist thought and movement were marginal. So I wanted to place the Japanese left and communism at the center of the story and explore the imperial period from that point of view. So a lot of the interwar developments in Japan happen either as a reaction or in conversation with the rise of socialist ideas globally and domestically. So when we talk about socialism or communism in East Asia, countries where communist parties eventually came to power, such as China, Mongolia, North Korea, Vietnam, come to mind first. Imperial Japan is excluded from this conversation, despite the fact that it controlled those territories where communist parties eventually succeeded. Even the Russian Bolsheviks in the 1920s realized the importance of Japan. Grigory Zinoviev, the first head of the Comintern, or the Third Communist International, said in 1922, quote, "There is no issue in East Asia that didn't involve the Japanese Empire. The Japanese proletariat held the key to the solution of the Far Eastern question and would decide the fate of several 100 million people living in China, Korea, and Mongolia," end of quote. Zinoviev also predicted that the next World War would happen in the Pacific, and that would be a catalyst and once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the Japanese proletariat to topple the imperial regime and the existing social and economic order, similar to the opportunity that the Russian Bolsheviks seized at the end of World War I. So I identified three leftist groups that engaged not only with the ideas of the Russian Revolution, but also with its agents, Russian, Korean, and Chinese communists. The three groups were anarchists, the Japanese Communist Party, and National Socialists. Importantly, these divisions didn't exist before 1919, and it took a decade for these ideological groups to stabilize, so to speak. No less because the Russian Revolution was still ongoing, and the Bolsheviks were sending mixed signals to communists worldwide. Founders of these groups, such as Osugi Sakai, Arahata Kanson, Yamakawa Hitoshi, Takabatake Motoyuki, and others, were all close friends prior to 1919. A decade later, they would not speak to each other, accusing each other of misinterpretation or even betrayal of original Marxist ideas. All three groups agreed that a revolution was necessary in Japan, that socioeconomic conditions were inhumane, and that the political leadership had to go. The difference between them was about the means, how and when a revolution could be achieved, and how a new order would look like. For the JCP, dictatorship of the Soviets, not the party, was the ideal. For the National Socialists, it was a national technocratic elite and centralized redistributive economy. And for the anarchists, a society based on mutual aid or industrial unionism. All of these three loosely defined groups, however, didn't consider the Russian Revolution as the only revolutionary model. Neither they thought that the Russians knew much about conditions in East Asia to order directives on how to organize a revolutionary struggle there. My project, however, expanded beyond the confines of the leftist groups when I realized that geopolitical issues and foreign policy had a great impact not only on the Japanese left, but also on the way the imperial state reacted to Soviet communism. In other words, in Japan's responses to the Russian Revolution, both geopolitical and ideological factors seemed to play equally important role. So I think previous scholarship has tended to look at these factors separately. On the one side, there was Japanese left and largely the story of its systematic suppression by the imperial state and police. I think there was much more nuance in the relation between the state and the left in terms of ideas and people. And on the other hand, international history has explored Soviet-Japanese relations, but focused largely on the diplomatic and military confrontation of these two ideological rivals. So on the one side, communist Russia, and on the other side is anti-communist Japan. There are numerous works on border conflicts between Manchukuo and the Soviet state, on the Nomonhan battle, or in Russian it's known as the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol, and the end of the Asia-Pacific War. So to reconsider Japan's attitude to communism means to think about bigger questions of what was Imperial Japan. How did the Japanese people think about their own state and society and its future? How did Japan see itself within the East Asian region? What were the objectives of its foreign policy? I tried to answer these questions by looking at the ideological debates within the left, but I also discussed the political and military elites thinking about communism and the Soviet state. So once it became obvious to the Japanese elite that the Bolshevik government was to stay for a foreseeable future, they began to ask questions. What was the Bolshevik regime? Was it a radical entity aimed at bringing a world proletarian revolution and then that Bolshevik state would disappear? Or was it perhaps less normal, but still a state concerned with preservation of its territory and in this sense, the heir to Imperial Russia? So answering these questions was complicated because the Bolshevik government and its leadership was sending mixed signals. On the one hand, they created the first truly global revolutionary organization, the Comintern, that worked on destabilizing foreign states by creating communist parties. On the other hand, the Soviet Foreign Ministry worked hard to establish diplomatic relations with those same foreign capitalist powers to secure the survival of the Soviet state. So Soviet officials did their utmost to distance themselves from the Comintern, which they claimed was an international organization that had nothing to do with the USSR. Of course, people didn't believe it, but many influential groups in Japan seized on this rhetorical distinction between the Comintern and the Soviet state and began to advocate rapprochement with the Bolsheviks. So Japan's engagement with communist Russia should not be limited to the post-revolutionary period, I argued in my book. Instead, we need to look at the long durée of the Russo-Japanese relations. And I try to demonstrate in my book how previous inter-imperial arrangements influence Japan's attitudes towards the Soviet Union. We also need to realize that Japan's thinking about communism was determined and mediated by what was between Japan and the Soviet Union, that is colonial Korea and China. So I concluded in my book that Japan's relations with Soviet Russia were determined ultimately not by ideology, but by the factors that would ensure stability and security of the empire. So I want to switch gears here a bit and tell you one story of one individual. So part of the fun in researching for this book was not only grappling with these big ideas and relations between empires, but also to learn about real people, their life stories, and their aspirations and hopes. And today I want to tell you about one individual. His name was Takao Heibe. He was born in 1895. He worked some small jobs in Osaka when he heard about the Russian Revolution and became interested in socialist anarchist ideas. In 1918, he moved to Tokyo to join the anarchists. Eventually, he organized a small group of young people who participated in labor strikes, the number of which proliferated enormously after 1919. So anarchist ideas of direct action were extremely popular among striking workers, and it was around the growing labor movement that the new and old anarchists congregated. So when the Comintern managed to send its first envoys, who were Korean and Chinese, to Japan in 1920, the order was specifically to target and win over anarchist workers and intellectuals, because they seemed to be the most mobile, action-oriented, and possessing wide networks. In 1921, Takao got involved into the so-called Morito incident. A junior economics professor at Tokyo Imperial University, Morito Tatsuo, published an article on Kropotkin's anarchist communism, which caught attention of a right-wing group that managed to blow it into a major controversy in the media. Morito was fired. In response, Takao distributed his article together with Kropotkin's book, Law and Authority, on the streets of Tokyo, for which he was arrested and imprisoned for 5 months. In 1921, Zhang Tailei, one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party, arrived to Japan on behalf of the Comintern to recruit Japanese leftists to attend the Congress of Far Eastern People, which was actually Soviet Russia's response to the Washington Naval Conference, to which it was not invited. So Takao was among 7 Japanese representatives to attend the conference. However, he didn't reach Moscow, but stayed in Shanghai, where he met the Comintern representative Grigory Voitinsky. Takao returned back to Tokyo with the Comintern funds, which were used for various campaigns. In March 1922, Takao and other members of his anarchist group, Rodosha, entered Siberia and established in the Siberian town of Chita a printing shop. The shop produced propaganda leaflets for the Japanese army stationed also in Chita. The army, of course, was part of the Japanese intervention into the Russian Revolution, which lasted between late 1917 and 1925. More than 70,000 troops occupied territory east of Lake Baikal, and another about 60,000 troops were in North Manchuria along the Chinese Eastern Railway, or in Russian is Китайско-Восточная железная дорога, which Japan had desired for a long time. So the threat of the Japanese army to the young Bolshevik regime was enormous. Japan supported the White Army led by Admiral Kolchak, provided funds, ammunition, and military instructors to other anti-Bolshevik forces, most notoriously to Kazakh Ataman Grigory Semyonov. In 1918, Lenin even sought to sell Kamchatka to the United States, so the US would have to deal with Japan and its growing power in the Russian Pacific. So Takao's work in Chita, in the Siberian town, was coordinated by the veteran socialist Katayama Sen, whose life is no less fascinating. So Katayama immigrated to the US after the high treason incident in 1911, when a group of anarchist socialists was accused of plotting to assassinate the Meiji emperor. These anarchists, by the way, in turn, very inspired by the Russian populists, Narodniki, who assassinated Alexander II in 1881. So ending up eventually in New York, Katayama came in contact with Trotsky, Bukharin, Volodarsky, and Kollontai just before their departure back to Russia after the February Revolution. He came to Moscow in 1921 to attend a Communist Congress and never left, becoming a member of the executive committee of the Comintern and coordinating the work of Eastern Communist parties. So Katayama brought Takao to Moscow in summer 22, where he had several meetings with Bukharin, Zinoviev, and above all, Vladimir Lenin himself. So after summer in Moscow, Takao wrote a pamphlet which was titled Revolution or Death, which was seized by the police at the port of Nagasaki. The pamphlet preached that the general strike would lead to a violent revolution in Japan in 1924, that the rich will be arrested, the army disbanded, and the Soviets and the Red Army and the Japanese Red Army established. The new society in Japan would have no private property managed by the centralized administration. Factories would be expropriated by the workers, and the dictatorship of the proletariat would run the country. So upon his return to Japan, a few months later, Takao got briefly involved into high diplomacy. In 1922, Soviet Russia and Japan began to negotiate a recognition of the Soviet state. Japanese elites were wary of the Bolsheviks' plans in Asia, especially as the CCP and JCP were just established in that year, and the Red Army entered Outer Mongolia in 1921. So allegedly, Lenin, in his meeting with Takao, assured that Soviet Bolsheviks didn't have any plans to destabilize Japanese domestic politics. So upon his return, Takao met with his very good friend, none other than Nakano Seigo, who would become eventually a very influential, radical, populist, right-wing politician. Some call him, some historians call him a Japanese fascist. So Nakano, in turn, met with his good friend, Goto Shinpei, to pass Lenin's message. So a very famous and important figure of Imperial Japan, Goto Shinpei, was a member of the House of Peers, the first president of the South Manchurian Railway, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and so on. So since 1922, Goto Shinpei became the main advocate for approachment with Russia and was supported by many influential groups. His supporters came from the Navy and the Army, major nationalist organizations such as Kokuryukai or the Amur River Society, and big business, especially among the fishery and mining. And so Goto argued in his public speeches that the Russian Revolution was actually modernizing and nationalist in the manner of the major revolution. And in terms of communist ideology, Goto argued that international communism was a delusion and could not be realized in practice. So in general, the Japanese leadership carefully followed the internal struggles of the Russian Communist Party, especially the struggle between Stalin and Trotsky. But they took those struggles as signs of the party's decline and degeneration. Now, what is amazing for me in this story was how easy a vagabond, Takao, like a nobody basically, Takao Heibei, had contacts with a famous and high-flying politician like Nakano Seigo, and through him got in contact with Goto Shinpei himself, one of the most powerful men of his time. Another amazing fact is that this supposedly right-wing nationalists and conservatives had contacts among the most radical leftists and were fine in getting and sharing information. So what I want to say with this story, first, that the political scene in the 1920s was much more fluid and flexible than we think. Rigid ideological divisions within the left were not formed yet. Hence, Takao Heibei, who claimed to be an anarchist and subscribed to anarchist tactics, was also a member of the Japanese Communist Party. Neither the right was uniform. And so throughout the 1920s, people changed allegiances and loyalties from the left to the right and back. Takao Heibei's romance with the JCP ended, however, quickly. He was accused of spending Comintern money on a prostitute, when in fact he gave money to a gravely ill Japanese prostitute in Harbin, so she could return back to Hiroshima, basically to die. Moreover, Takao and radicals like him grew also impatient with the theoretical disputes between the different strands of the left. For radical activists like Takao, these theoretical speculations had little to do with the work on the ground that needed to be done. So Takao, for example, couldn't understand why his role model, anarchist Osugi Sakai, turned against the Soviet Bolsheviks and even began to support the Japanese intervention into the Russian Revolution. So on his part, Osugi was disappointed in the diminishing role of the workers' Soviets in Russia and in the Russian Communist Party, which he found too dictatorial and too centralized. In 1920, Osugi met Russian communists in Shanghai and was taken aback by their self-righteousness and by their almost missionary zeal to ignite socialist revolutions in Asia. So the last year of his life, Takao dedicated to the struggle with right-wing gangs, which emerged around 1920, and whose main task was to break labor strikes and intimidate labor leaders. Many of these gangs were funded by big management, by big capital, and even, according to some rumors, by the Ministry of Justice. In summer 1923, in one of the street fights, Takao was killed by a right-wing mob. 2 months later, in September 1923, his mentor, Osugi Sakai, his partner, anarchist feminist Ito Noe, and his young nephew were murdered by the military police. Anarchism didn't die with them. However, and the JCP also went strong for another decade, gaining a wide membership. Goto Shinpei's work also bore fruit. In 1925, Japan recognized the Soviet Union, established trade relations, and gained fishery and mining concessions. So I chose today to tell you a life story of one individual who was not a great statesman, changing the course of international relations, nor was he an influential socialist theoretician. Those people are also in my book, by the way. And Takao was a typical young man of the late 1910s who dedicated his life to a greater cause, and who died in a street fight with fascist gangs, not unlike those in the late Weimar Berlin. But his life was also not typical in that he was one of the few Japanese whose horizon was wide and who dared to go and work in the war-torn Russia, coming in contact with Russian revolutionary legends. His life mirrored all the complexities of the Japanese political landscape, in which different interpretations of the Russian Revolution overlapped with distinct visions of what modern Japan ought to be. His life also mirrored all the complexities of the Japanese-Soviet relations, which followed its own logic in the pursuit for a mutually beneficial economic and political partnership on the Asian continent. Well, that's it from me. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. I want to just say thank you, Seiji, so much for that lovely introduction, and also congratulations on your new book. I'm really looking forward to having it on the shelf. And also just to say, what an honor and a privilege it is to be here, to be invited to be the discussant for this book, which I've seen in different incarnations, and I read again today, and it's such a great read. You can't always say that about academic books, but this one really is a wonderful read. So I want to, in my time, make some comments and pose a couple questions for Tatiana. So I know this is a period that I'm, pretty familiar with of Japanese history, but there was a lot that was new to me in this book. And one of the things that I learned a lot about was the Siberian Expedition, which is one of the first instances of revolution going east. And Tatiana's book gives this just very riveting account of the battles on the ground between the revolutionaries and the counter-revolutionaries, and the high drama of the Japanese efforts to intervene in this conflict. But to me, one of the most really interesting parts of this account is getting into the importance of the link-ups between Russian revolutionaries and Chinese, and especially Korean, anti-colonial activism in Manchuria. This is such an important part of the kind of rising tide of revolutionary nationalism in the Japanese Empire. But it really scrambles the narratives that we have about the emergence of anti-colonial nationalism, and in particular the May 4th movement in China and the March 1st movement in Korea, which typically have been, we've understood that those were really triggered by the Paris Peace Conference, by Wilsonianism, and the sort of ideas of a self-determination that got put into circulation with that big event. And what Tatiana's book shows is that actually it was the experience with these Bolshevik agents and the example of the Russian Revolution that was perhaps more influential in shaping this very important founding moment of anti-colonial nationalism. So I thought that was really a really important intervention. Another thing that Tatiana brings out in her account of the Siberian intervention is the ways in which it was a kind of a presaging or a pre-staging of geopolitical strategies of informal or less formal rule that the Japanese deployed to very great effect in Manchuria, in the rest of occupied China, and in Southeast Asia. And so her account of, she describes the use of buffer states and attempted, puppet regimes. And again, this was something that was really new to me, learning about this. And the description, it suggests that what was happening in Siberia was, a different form of, informal colonialism or semi-colonialism. It's something short of colonization, but it's aspiring to something more than simply a sphere of influence. And I think that, this is another really interesting way to think about the connections between the 20s and the 1930s. And I guess the question that I wanted to ask in connection to this is, how you would, what would you say about those connections? If I pushed you to be explicit, what do you think about the relationship between the buffer states of Siberia and these puppet states in China and perhaps in Southeast Asia. That clearly there was the revolutionary threat and from Bolshevism was a major factor in Siberia. So is that the same thing that's going on in, say, China and in Manchuria? And, there's been a lot of historical debate over, why it was that agents of Japanese empire on the ground chose to use the political form of the puppet state, or some sort of client state, rather than simply annexing and setting up like a governor general in the same way that they did in Korea and Taiwan. So there was this other model available, but no, something new was done with Manchukuo. And I guess I ask you that because I think that your argument really goes against the kind of things that someone like Prasenjit Dwara is suggesting when he's in his book Sovereignty and Authenticity. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, where he really talks about Manchukuo as a political form that's the first instantiation of a form of kind of client state imperialism that the United States is going to practice after the 1950s. So his argument is looking forward and saying Japan's sort of starting this way of doing imperialism without colonies, pretending you're not an imperialist while you're being an imperialist. But I feel like your argument points backwards and says that there's a deeper roots to this. Another dimension of this book that I found really fascinating and incredibly helpful in giving me a new understanding of the politics and the kind of the intellectual history of politics in this period is your account of Russia and the Soviet Union as central to geopolitical imaginaries that we can trace back to the late 19th century and on into the 20th century. And you give a really wonderful and very fleshed out kind of genealogy of this quite complicated and contradictory, internally contradictory in some respects, geopolitical imaginary. And I found it particularly helpful the way that you tease out the lineaments of a Russophile and a Russophobe, the Russophilia and the Russophobia, and how that kind of then morphs into a pro-communism and an anti-communism. And this interesting dualism on the Japanese side is not paralleled exactly, but there is a dualism on the Russian side as well that you talk about. That where there's the Comintern versus the I don't know what the name for the Soviet foreign ministry is, but anyway, what you lay out so clearly and do so well here is to really show how that dualism, that those two strands of thought are mapped onto bureaucratic factionalism. So even in Manchuria, the Guandong Army, these two really important institutions, the South Manchurian Railway and the Guandong Army. The Guandong Army is this sort of hotbed of anti-communism, and the South Manchurian Railway is a generator of pro-Russian and pro-Soviet attitudes and personnel. And this pro-Soviet, anti-Soviet division characterizes the Army versus the Navy, but also opposing factions within the Foreign Ministry and other important ministries, the Home Ministry and the Justice Ministry. So I just thought that was really very interesting. And you also kind of trace that out the way in terms of looking at the love of Russian literature, which, anybody who studies Japan in the late 19th century, the enormous impact that multiple generations of of intellectuals, the literary establishment, but not just them, and their sense of kind of cultural identification that's both sentimental but also kind of existential. And so that thing is going on at the same time that Russia and Japan are these like bitter rivals and geostrategic enemies, both coveting the same territories in Korea and Manchuria and Siberia. And so you help us understand that this worldview that the elites have, kind of is broadly shared across the elite world. People that are socialized at the, within these higher education institutions kind of get that attitude. They get both of those attitudes. And that's partly one of the things that accounts for this funny dualism. And it's also an international and a domestic split, and you lay that out as well, that there's this kind of pro-Japanese Pan-Asianism that lines up with a support for Russia, but domestically, there's a sense of anti-communism that is fed by the spread of radicalism in the 1920s. So in all of those ways, I think that you really sort of lay that out nicely, and it helps me to understand how it is that you can get a situation in the 1930s where a militaristic and fascistic government uses Soviet models of the command economy, so that the total war state becomes really kind of modeled in critical ways on Soviet ideas. And also how these like rabidly anti-communist officers in the Guangdong army could then be kind of okay with working with and collaborating with these socialist and Marxian influenced scholars and researchers in the South Manchurian Railway. So I thought that was it was a very nice accounting of that real historical puzzle. So my question is related to that. Do you think that your analysis of the 20s and 30s in this kind of this pro-anti, this Russophilia, Russophobia, does that help us understand what happens in the post 1945 period? Because I think that, a lot of times the Cold War in Asia and the whole communism, anti-communism gets understood as kind of another version of what's happening in Europe. But in fact, it's very different. And your analysis, I think, points us to some of the ways that it's different. And you actually said in your opening remarks that, that all of these communist states in Asia, one of the things that people just don't notice about it is that they are former colonies or former semi-colonies. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about, what anti-communism means in Cold War and post-Cold War Asia, or not, post-Cold War Asia, because we still have the Cold War persists in Asia, in the two Chinas and in the two Koreas. So there is just so much to talk about here, but the final thing I want to ask you about, and this is also kind of making a connection between your period and the post-war, and that's, your wonderful analysis of those three intellectuals and their engagement with Comintern activism and with the Bolshevik Revolution. And I was really struck by how, you showed that one of the ways that, there was a bunch of reasons that, there were some problems in their thinking. You highlighted some of the flaws in this left-wing thought. But one of the things that you highlight is how they're blinkered by the empire, and how, by the time of the like early 21, 22, they, you know, there's really the end of the engagement with transnational radical, like Korean and Chinese revolutionaries. So there, and that there's, and that Yamakawa, I think you mentioned, you know, he's really stuck in this hierarchical way of thinking that Japan is civilized and Korea and China are still sort of semi-civilized. So that really blocks him from engaging in, you know, some kind of theoretical activity that he potentially could. So do you think that this difficulty in engaging other Asian countries in dialogic terms and, you know, on an equal playing field is something that carries over into the post-war period, and that really that blocks perhaps the left, the Marxian left in particular, from coming, you know, carrying out any kind of reckoning with its colonial past, and the sort of missed opportunity of the 50s really and 60s of trying to come to terms with colonialism, and the fact that, again, that just this blinkeredness means that they think of the empire and the history of the empire in these very abstract economistic terms, stage theory and so on, highest stage of capitalism. And also when they think about Japan and empire in, you know, in the 1950s, it's really Japan as the victim of American imperialism rather than Japan as perhaps, you know, an empire or even an informal empire, you know, in the post-war period. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Louise. So big questions. Yes, thank you so much for your comments and for all the support along the way. All right, so I will start with the second issue, the second question you raised there, because I think that's where the story begins. And as I said, look, we cannot talk about communism and anti-communism after 1917 without thinking, you know, or being aware how Japan thought about Imperial Russia. And Imperial Russia was, yes, it was central to the geopolitical sort of geocultural vision of East Asia. And I think the trouble I had when I started this project is, you know, in East Asian studies, I mean, it's changing now, but Russia or Soviet Russia, or Imperial Russia is not included. Or it's included only in the way that, you know, there was the Russo-Japanese War, there was just another war, another conflict, but, you know, like engage intellectually and culturally with all the connections that existed. That is done, but by very, very few scholars. So that was for me the starting point, that Russia was part of East Asian history as much as Japan was part of Russian history. And so for the, as you mentioned, there was a strong interest in not only Russian literature, but sort of Russian social thought and intellectual thought, especially because the Japanese realized that Russia itself was also in this very strange position, or it was, you know, the self-perception of Russian intellectuals was that, you know, we are not completely the West, but we are not the East, and the whole this Eurasian thought comes out. Japanese, by the way, translated the word Eurasia from the Russian language. Eurasia, it's translation from the Russian, and so this kind of in between us, the Japanese also felt a strong affinity with that, and they sympathized, and they also sympathized with the Russian critique of Western capitalism, of this Western modernity, which they, you know, they were really inspired by that. So I argued in my book that this critique of you know, 19th century capitalism, of all the social ills and social, you know, problems it brings, resonated with the, not only with, you know, Japanese lower class, let's say, but also with the officers, with the military, with the political elite, with the business elite. So it didn't depend on class. So that prepared because there was a lot of unhappiness as well in modern Japan with the West, with how industrialization was going and westernization and so on. And so that prepared ground for the sort of more favorable reception of communist ideas, Soviet communist ideas. As Goto Shinpei, I mentioned, as Goto Shinpei argued very curiously, right, that he compared the Russian Revolution with the Meiji Revolution, and that both revolutions were revolutions of modernization. And the main slogan in both revolutions were to expel barbarians, and to expel barbarians, to expel the foreigners, and to make country independent and wealthy, and so on. The Bolsheviks' anti-colonial message, right, was also very important. And this anti-colonial message also comes from this the Russian in-betweenness. And the Japanese Pan-Asianists, and that's the very, very kind of interesting moment, that right-wing Japanese Pan-Asianists, they for the whole 1920s, they sympathized with this Bolshevik anti-colonial message, and they really thought that the Soviet Union is sort of a bulwark against the Western imperialism, and they should unite. And and then you can extend this line until Matsuoka Yosuke, who proposed to Stalin to create this Eurasian bloc where Germany, Russia, Soviet Union, and Japan would sort of control this heartland, right, the mainland, against the Anglo-Saxons or Anglo-Saxon imperialism. Yeah, and that explains, right, why some military officers also sympathized with this, with the work the Bolsheviks were doing against Western or American imperialists as well. Talking about Siberia and what's happening in Manchuria a decade later, we can even extend it further, further back than the Siberian intervention. We can go back to the Russo-Japanese War. The interesting thing is, what I found so fascinating, and it's a kind of a sign of the longevity of the Japanese generals. So some officers who were, active during the Manchurian takeover, they started their careers during the Russo-Japanese War. And so you see basically the same people who started as young military officers in the Russo-Japanese War, then they participated in the Siberian intervention, went to the Russian territory, and then sort of being a great sort of statesman, great generals, ended up in Manchuria in the 1930s. So you see here this connection with how did they think about the region and what kind of plans they proposed. There was never one plan for Siberia or North Manchuria. There were many competing. There were like very radical plans to establish, formal control, to annex, but they were in the minority. The majority actually thought about a sort of a client state, a buffer state, where they would inject, lots of money and then pump up resources after building this infrastructure. I think your question, Louise, was why they didn't create a formal colony, right?
Yeah, just what does it? Is there something about the threat of Bolshevik radicalism, or the sort of Japanese military response to that particular geostrategic threat, that lends itself to this strategy and tactics of the puppet state model, rather than, because that wasn't a salient factor when Taiwan or Korea were colonized.
Okay, so yes, I remember. Yeah, so the Siberian Republic, Tanaka Giichi, the famous Tanaka Giichi, who's, you know, allegedly wrote the Tanaka Memorandum. So Tanaka Giichi, he proposed in 1920 to create a Siberian Republic that would act as a buffer state between the Western Russia, which was under the control of the Bolsheviks, and East Asia. Yeah, so those projects among the military was specifically to stop the advance of the Bolsheviks. Interesting thing how, and I also discussed this in this book, how did they think about communism in Russia, Soviet communism? What were the origins? So initial response that it was an influence of German prisoners of war, that it was like they call it a disease, a pest. So it's like a disease that comes with people, with foreigners. And so the German prisoners of war, the German refugees, or the Russian soldiers who came in contact in Europe with the Germans, they got infected with this disease and they brought it to Russia. So how we can protect Japan is just to close the borders or create this buffer state between us and this, you know, already infected Bolsheviks, and just don't allow these people to come in and don't allow our people to go there. But then this question that you mentioned about these people in between, right, the Chinese and Korean radicals, how to control them, and because Korea is already a colony, they had a relatively easy mobility, so they could move from, you know, the Korean Peninsula to Japan, back to Korean Peninsula, then they would pass to the Russian Far East, get funds, get guns, you know, all sorts of stuff. It's a study that I couldn't just do for this book, but the movements of radical Koreans between Russia and Japan, this is just another amazing story. Yeah, absolutely. So in the 1930s, it's the same sort of concern that to put something between us and them and don't allow just our people, you know, to just mingle with those radicals. Yeah, and about the post-war period, I'm not sort of, I don't go there in my book, and this needs like a, you know, further sort of research, because so many things, you know, the American Empire comes in, but this idea that what I found in the left that comes actually from the, you know, from the 19th century, this idea that history is linear and it's hierarchical. And you know, this the idea of progress, and that people are judged by the way, you know, on this scale. That's what in the end precluded the Japanese left to, you know, to treat other Asian radicals equally. They even considered Russia, Imperial Russia, to be more backward than Imperial Japan. And so this was one of the reasons why they didn't think about the Russian Revolution as the model for the future revolutions, socialist revolutions. They didn't take that seriously, Russian Bolsheviks, because they saw that how could these people from this backward Russia to claim that, you know, we should follow that, we should kind of follow their directives, their orders, when we are more advanced than them. And so I find that sort of way of thinking persisting even after 1945. All right, thank you.
Okay, so we'll jump into the Q&A section for the last half hour. Oftentimes when we talk about Japanese history, leftist history related to Chinese, Korean, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, we don't have the Russian dimension or the Russian language sources, and you have a very special, unique skill set of using Russian and Japanese archives. So could you talk about how these sort of the Russian sources fill out a need that has been sort of left out of usual Japanese imperial or international history in Eurasia? And then just the process of combining Russian and Japanese archives to create your book.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Yes, very important. So I use for the Russian side, I use the Comintern archives, and those archives, the Comintern archives, they're published and they even translated into Japanese, although the Japanese translation, there are some differences between the Russian publication and the Japanese one. So I look at both, and the Comintern archives, which were published after the during the 1990s, after all these archives in Russia were declassified, they are, anyone can access them. You just, I think they are in many libraries. Just people need to go and read them and look them. It's not that I unearthed something in some local archive. I went to Moscow to the Archive of Social and Political History, and I look at the files of Katayama-sen, to look at the Comintern files that were not, they didn't make it into this published book. And there are also some published in Russian communication between Goto Shinpei and Stalin and other top Russian leaders. So that is also available, and anyone can read them. On the Japanese side, I went to the Foreign Ministry archives, and which I also published, or there are some archives that are now available online. And they're just writings of those Japanese leftists that are also published, like edited, collected volumes.
Okay, so one of the second questions by Nikolai is concerning the Japanese emperor, how you state in your book that the emperor was viewed as a modern unifying figure. But was the anarchist assassination attempt, drawing parallels to the assassination of the Romanovs, a turning point for Japanese communism to become anti-monarchical? And how does this relate to the role of the emperor in modern democratic Japan?
So unfortunately not. The assassination of, so the anarchists, Japanese anarchists were really inspired by the Russian populist Narodniki and their assassination of Alexander II. If you look at the prison, the interrogation reports, those anarchists say that we wanted to kill, they basically would say, they did say the same things that the Russians said some 30 years earlier, that we wanted to kill him and to show his blood and flesh and to show the Japanese people that he is not divine, that he is as human as we are. After the communist movement, Japanese leftists after the Russian Revolution, during the 1920s, they didn't touch upon this question of the monarchy. So if you look at the old English scholarship, they would usually insist that from early on, the Japanese Communist Party insisted on the abolition of the monarchy as the sort of their main goal. But I think the recent Japanese scholarship, actually based on the Comintern archives, there is some Kato Tetsuro historian. He found Japanese letters from the Japanese Communist Party to Moscow, and their communication, which showed that the monarchy was not an issue. That the Bolsheviks even didn't insist on the abolition of the monarchy during the 1920s. And the Japanese themselves didn't raise this question until late 1920s, after the Manchurian incident, that became the main sort of, yes, we need to, the monarchy is the main sort of target, but that was not an issue in the 1920s.
Okay, great. This is from Jane Burbank. A question about the attitudes of Bolshevik leaders. You talk about Lenin, et cetera, and it seems that they had Eurocentric views on revolution, on the East, and on Japanese communists. So her question is regarding Lenin's Orientalism in the Bolsheviks insisting that Russian communists must control and lead and know best about international communism. Were they consistently, quote unquote, Western in their attitudes? And do you think that any of them imagined that new ideas, strategies could come from their Asian colleagues, or were they hopelessly Eurocentric? I would just add, how does your book in this way sort of contribute to Russian or Soviet historiography? If you could maybe expand on that.
Well, Marx, right, and then Lenin famously expected socialist revolutions to happen in the West. And in terms of the non-Western colonies, the rebellions or revolts, anti-imperialist movements in the colonies would assist the true socialist proletarian revolutions in Europe. That's where they expected that. And when that didn't happen, when the German Revolution in 1923 collapsed, then the sort of, and even before that, the attention turned to Asia. I talked about Zinoviev, who expected the Japanese proletariat, who was the most sort of advanced in Asia. Maybe there something would happen. So there were these ideas, but at the end, yes, the Russians thought that they were, more advanced in terms of political consciousness and understanding of history and historical, development. And so the rift between the Japanese Communist Party and the Comintern happened precisely because of this issue, because with the Chinese Revolution after 1925, the Comintern began to insist that the Japanese Communist Party should prioritize China rather than Japan. And the Japanese communists, not all of them, but some of them, didn't accept the directives of the Comintern in this sense, saying that, first of all, you don't know conditions in East Asia, and second of all, you are building your strategy on the wrong understanding of history. And very Eurocentric history, yes.
Another follow-up question about English language works that are related to your works on Japanese leftist intellectuals movements that came out in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Were they shaped by the Cold War in ways that are different from your approach?
Yeah, so the main works are done by Robert Scalapino and Bergman. And then I think the last one was written by the Jermaine Houston in 1981-82. And I believe so, yes. First of all, as I mentioned also in the beginning, the picture comes is that this leftist groups were systematically suppressed. So there was this big state and big police, one block, and then there is the left, which is sort of on defense, and they are extremely antagonistic, and the state is sort of this very anti-communist, eventually by the early 1930s, this communist movement and the left in general sort of dies, and not dies, but sort of goes really underground and had little influence on the politics, on the culture, on society. And so I found that to be a bit simplistic. I think they didn't, they assumed that the Japanese elite was this anti-communist, right? But then when you look at what they say, what they write, and what they do, actually, it's very different from how the Americans or Europeans think about the Russian communists. Very pragmatic, and they were very pragmatic, and their anti-communism, was very conditional. Was depending on the situation in East Asia. Was a lot dependent on what was happening in China, actually.
From obviously your colleague Rebecca Carl. Her question is on ideology, this idea that ideology was more fluid and less important than usually argued in terms of your history. And she's saying, she obviously agrees that ideology of communism, Bolshevism was malleable, but her question is there really no ideology in affirming a strong central state and nationalist economy as the major goals or significance of historical process itself? And how do you deal with this relationship between thought, ideology, and practice in your historical account of fluidity?
When I say that ideology didn't matter, I mainly mean how did the Japanese government build its foreign relations with the Soviet communism. And so, for example, one account, right, the British, they cut, once they found out, they recognized the Soviet Union, but then once they found out the Comintern was operating inside the UK, they cut relationship, official relationship with the Soviet Union. Japan, even though they knew that the Comintern was operating and sponsoring, this different leftist organizations within Japan, they didn't do that, and they didn't even kind of talk about that. They didn't sort of address that question. Sort of, they just decided to ignore that, and because the geopolitical matters and what was happening in China was much more important for them. So as I said, they were very pragmatic in the sense, like they were not like, oh, they're they're communists, they want to abolish the monarchy, or they wanted to abolish the capitalist class, and so we will not talk to them at all. That attitude was not the guiding sort of principle of the Japanese foreign policy. And in this sense, I meant that they would kind of, even though they would maybe disagree with this communist ideas, they would prefer kind of to deal, sort of follow the realpolitik in this matter. With the ideology did matter within Japan. And so one of this, and so I did my framework was, when you look at the foreign policy, that ideology did more geopolitical concerns were more important. But if you look at the situation within Japan, at the Home Ministry and Justice Ministry, yes, the peace preservation law, the arrest of the leftists, and so on. And there was a genuine concern. And the one point that they really emphasize is this issue of class struggle. And this idea of, that there are antagonistic social classes, and the goal is to bring the proletariat to power. That really unnerved the conservatives and actually liberals as well. So yeah, there are different mechanisms that are designed how to keep people and ideas in check. But in the end, I was saying that these spheres were sort of separated, the domestic and the foreign, and they sort of didn't interfere with each other.
Okay, great. So next question by YC Chen is, if you can sort of compare the influence or impact of the 1905 Russian Revolution compared to 1917 on Meiji socialists or Japanese socialists such as Katayama-sen, Kotoku Shusui. She's saying, or this person is saying, that experiences in Russia have been important references at different stages, whether it's in 1905 or in 1917. So if you could compare those two turning points.
Yes, so experiences in Russia had been, yes, important references in Japan. So Kotoku Shusui, one of those executed in the high treason incident in 1911, there is only one English language work on him, monograph on him, and very, very old monograph. And so he, at one point, he went to, after the Russian Revolution, 1906, he came to San Francisco and spent 1 year there. And so that monograph looks at, how he was in contact with the American workers and, kind of involved in the, with the San Francisco workers movement, labor movement. But if you look at, actually, again, his writings, that I did, he rented a room in the house of a Russian revolutionary emigre who put him in contact with Kropotkin. So he wrote actually letters to Kropotkin. He was in contact with Lenin, who asked him to, in 1905, right, he was still unknown, being in Switzerland in exile. So Lenin asked him to distribute revolutionary pamphlets among the Russian prisoners of war, which Kotok Shisui and other socialists did. The pamphlets were smuggled through Sakhalin and Hokkaido and to Nagasaki. And there is a case with Narodniki, with the Russian populists. So again, that's not much sort of done on this topic, but I think after the Russian Revolution in 1905, beginning with the Kotoku Shisui, the Japanese socialists began to really pay attention to what was happening in Russia. Some of them expected that, yes, the changes, I mean, some revolutionary changes would come from Russia, but at the same time, there was a strong trend within the Japanese left who sort of, followed the Second International, sort of very Marxist orthodox, expecting that the changes would come from Western Europe, and Russia is really like backward country.
Okay, so Robert Cribb's question related to Louise's comment. When Japanese planners thought of using the Siberian intervention to create a buffer state, did they use the rhetoric of Asia for the Asians, Asiatics, that was prominent later in occupied Southeast Asia? Did they engage with local nationalist aspirations, for example, the Buryats?
Yeah, so this is my, it relates to my second research project. So they, interestingly, they supported the pan-Mongolist movement that was developing in 1919 in Outer Mongolia and Buryatia and Inner Mongolia. So there was an attempt to secede from Russia because Russia was disintegrating and there was no centralized authority. And so this Mongol-speaking groups on the borders, they thought it's a great, and China was also right in its own state of chaos, and the Japanese supported that pan-Mongolist movement. However, they didn't have any sort of kind of this proper ideas or theoretical tools, as they would have much later, how to talk to the pan-Mongolists, how to appeal to them with the pan-Asianist ideas. So that failed experience with, and it was a good opportunity for them, which they couldn't use. So that experience, that failed experience in Siberia and in Mongolia, sort of became one of the impulses, I believe, became one of the impulses for later development of pan-Asianist thought, for the kind of fleshing out of pan-Asianist thought. But it still was not developed in 1920.
Okay, so a question by Emily Perry. If Pan-Asianist thinkers saw Japan as a proletarian state oppressed by Western capitalist imperialism, yet also saw no difference between imperialism and socialism, why did Japan continue to have international diplomacy and cooperation with Russia? Why did they not turn inward toward isolationist policy and avoid both Western capitalist and Russian socialist influences?
Those are two stages, actually, that in the beginning, they saw that, yes, Russia and Japan are both proletarian states because they are oppressed by the Western imperialism. But then the idea that actually the Soviet Union is as imperialist as Imperial Russia was, that idea developed like later on in the mid 1920s. Interestingly, I think this idea that the Soviet Union actually was an empire, not just this radical state, happened after the Red Army entered Mongolia, Outer Mongolia. And when they established the first Soviet satellite state in Mongolia in 1924, after that, and sent the instructors, half of the Mongolian government were Russians. After that, the attitude changed, like, oh, maybe they are not you know, this radical anti-imperialist state. But at the same time, although the empire, well, you know, they knew how to deal with an empire. So, you know, we still could talk with empire. And that was not an obstacle for them.
So Nick Kapoor's question is, he read your book with his graduate seminar, and being good historians, they look deep into the footnotes, and they were saying that they noticed that you cited pretty few Russian language sources, whether it was primary or secondary, and was wondering whether this was a question of difficulties with accessing to Russian language archive and documents, or is it because Russian scholars have tended to overlook this period? So I guess a more source.
Yeah, because on the Russian sources, I look, as I said before, like I look at the communication between those, the letters between the Japanese and Russian leaders. But the point for me was, you know, how the Japanese thought about Russia, not what Russians thought about Japan. That would be a completely different book. And that's why I deliberately sort of didn't dig into the sort of Russian archives and Russian thinking about Japan. Because for me, the ultimate goal was to describe what was modern Japan through the lens of communism and the reception of communism. And so I show, you know, through this discussion of communism, I show how unstable was Japan in the 1920s, how different visions of the future existed in Japan, you know, from the vantage of the communist arrival.
So Ben Uchiyama's question related to what George had asked on about the emperor, wants to learn more about how Japanese communist pro-Soviet leaders reconciled the Bolshevik execution of the Russian emperor with the centrality of the Japanese emperor. For example, some Meiji Japanese elites were reluctant to adopt the French nation state building model because of the French Revolution, execution of the French king. And his question is, what arguments did people like Goto Shinpei make about explaining away the Bolshevik removal of the monarch? And did this reflect a deeper attitude among Japanese elites toward the monarchy at the time that we've been missing in Japanese historiography?
Yeah, and it again goes back to this understanding of the linear historical development. I think one Japanese journalist, after giving a lecture in Petersburg in 1919, was approached by a Russian who asked him, so we deposed, we got rid of our own monarch, why don't you get rid of your own monarch? And to which this Japanese very left-leaning journalist said, like, you know, the Romanov and our emperor have nothing in common. Your Romanov, your emperor, your monarch, he was really autocrat. He was backward, and you know, his time just came to go away. And while the Japanese emperor is very progressive, very modern, we have constitutional monarchy, which was, you know, the constitution was promulgated almost 20 years earlier than in Russia, which was a big deal. You know, the Japanese like to compare that Russia didn't have constitution when they had already. Yeah, so this idea of, they were on different stages. So the Romanov actually were often compared with the Tokugawa. So Tokugawa had to go like as a very feudal, you know, remnant. So was the Romanov. And the murders, the murder of the Romanov family in 1918, it was reported in Japanese newspapers, so it was known, but it really, you know, went unnoticed. There was no discussion of these murders, of the cruelty, right, of that actually children were murdered. That sort of went really unnoticed because in exactly that moment, the Japanese army entered the Russian territory. So that was in the Russian Far East. So that was sort of the topic of the day, you know, kind of the Japanese sort of moved on and really didn't give a second thought about the Russian monarchy.
Okay, so last question by Connie Xie, sort of asking about any connections between culture, ideology, and geopolitical military relations between Russia and Japan.
Between culture, what, sorry,
Just whether there are any connections between culture, cultural values, and then war strategies. In I guess in terms of shaping Russo-Japanese relations.
That's such a big question. I don't know how to where to start. The culture and strategies. I don't know. I need more sort of specific where to start.
Also, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks again to Tatiana and Louise for their comments and for the audience for your questions. Hopefully Tatiana can now get some rest in between teaching and then helping her first grader and fourth grader Zoom with school and then writing her second book. But we want to congratulate you once again for your wonderful first book and hope that people will buy it and download it and spread it. So
thank you so much. Great questions. I'm sorry if I didn't answer them fully. It's a lot to think. Yeah, but thank you so much to Louise and Seiji and to everyone who came.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Seiji and Louise, really for participating. And thank you, Tatiana, for such a really, really broad, but also very specific talk. And thank you for, especially Professor Shirane for moderating this. We had so many people participating, so we're going to make this available as a video later to continue this conversation. So thanks, everybody.